but I think they understand the ethics of it. We're now a bit more aware of the risks of publishing the glamorous research, which isn't right. Lives can be threatened, patient care can be really poor, can have massive impacts on human life by reporting this glamorous science which you've spun.
Adrian Aldcroft has been the editor-in-chief of the medical journal BMJ Open for 3 years. Adrian has been an editor for 12 years, working at PLOS ONE and the BMC series before taking over BMJ Open. Prior to becoming an editor, Adrian's own research background was in fMRI studies of the human brain. On this episode of the EMBO podcast, Adrian was joined by Thomas Lemberger, EMBO's deputy head of scientific publications, to discuss open science, preprints, and the role of peer review in basic and clinical research. Welcome to the EMBO podcast. Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory launched medRxiv with BMJ's collaboration in 2019. In December of the same year, EMBO and ASAP Bio launched Review Commons. Open science, preprints, and peer review were about to undergo a massive stress test. If we start very broadly, what would you say were the high points of open science during the COVID-19 pandemic?
I mean, it was a fascinating time, and it was a blessing to have preprints, especially medRxiv for us. They're just gotten up and running, like you said, 6 months prior, because for whatever reason, when lockdowns hit, our submissions to BMJ Open went up over 50%, and over 1,000 manuscripts a month. I think that was a combination of, we're a medical journal, there's a pandemic going on, there's a lot of research on this happening, but also a combination of that and researchers being at home, writing up their papers because their other research projects were put on hold. But the COVID papers that came into us, if it wasn't for medRxiv, I wouldn't have known what to do with them, because they were very timely, often built on less data than we would expect in a full research study, but obviously still really important from a public health perspective and in relation to the pandemic. But it would take us months to review something like this. We'd want to be careful about it. So the fact that medRxiv existed, even though I think what medRxiv was trying to achieve shifted a lot with the pandemic. Prior to that, it was a place to put your articles before submitting it to a scientific journal. It wasn't intended to be in the press or made public. But with COVID, it took on a whole different responsibility, where we could send those papers, which were important, but maybe not fully fleshed research studies, still quite early. We could send them to medRxiv, and it was just, for me, it was exactly the right place for them. It gets them up there quickly, and it gets it out there, and then a journal can take on the responsibility of reviewing it in detail such that it's elevated to the status of not fact, but trustworthy enough to publish in a journal. So yeah, really, really fascinating time for us. Yeah, and thinking back on it, there's a lot, as I'm sure you can relate, a lot for us to deal with, everyone having to shift to working from home and shifting to doing everything online. And I think in all senses, with Zoom and the online recording, and along with moving to preprints and open data, we weren't as prepared as we should have been for the pandemic, but we did have things in place such that we could manage. I think we were really lucky to have the preprints in place and really putting them to the test. Obviously preprints having a number of submissions which 6 months before they wouldn't have dreamt possible, and struggling to cope with that volume of submissions. But I think it's amazing that it worked as well as it did, and it wasn't perfect, but it was definitely a big learning experience for everyone.
I think there's one case that I find absolutely astonishing, which is while everyone was debating it's a still ongoing debate on the origins of the virus, there was a paper sitting at Scientific Reports from October to June, essentially, that had photographs of live animals in the Wuhan market which took almost a year to get published, which is, as we know, entirely normal for a scientific paper. So if something screamed urgency and this should have been pre-printed, and because regardless of what the central point of the paper was, what everybody would have liked to see is there are photographs of live animals in the market, which was a central question in the discussion. And what do you think went wrong from the point of view of open science and preprints during the year? To these years, actually, I shouldn't speak as if it's over. Sorry.
That's a good question. I guess from my perspective as the editor of a journal, ideally we would do things as quickly or nearly as quickly as you can do them on preprints. So, I mean, it's a huge benefit that we had different places for different things. And I think there's a lot of education of the public just to teach people what preprints meant. You know, it's not quite as good as an article, but it's still something, and it's great that it's out there quickly. But we'd still want that article, if it's important, if it's true, to be published in a journal as quickly as possible. So I think there was a risk that, it's gone to a preprint, it's gone to medRxiv. Now we can take our time with things, but there was that confusion over, they look the same. What is the difference between a preprint on medRxiv and an article online in BMJ Open? I think that gets quite confusing because at face value, they are the same and you really need to dig deeper. So I think, for me, we could never do things quickly enough. My team's grown a lot in these last few years. I think when COVID hit, we had 6 people as editors. Now we have more than twice that. So we needed to grow. We needed to grow quickly. So even though medRxiv and preprints have been massively useful, we weren't really genuinely prepared for something like this. And we should have been. I mean, there's been a lot of discussion that something like this was inevitable and that, monkeypox is happening now. Are we prepared for that even after this learning experience of COVID? Sort of, but not really. And I guess it's a question of resources because things like this aren't going to happen often, but they will happen. And I think we do need to take a perspective, especially with a medical journal where we're really at the heart of everything, that we do need to be prepared for events like this when they happen again, and they will happen again.
A debatable but plausible idea behind the publication of manuscripts before peer review was the notion that scientists should be able to critically read a manuscript on their own. What became apparent during the pandemic was that if a topic was under a spotlight, not everyone reading a preprint would have the benefit of scientific training.
When it came to can you promote preprints in the media, that became a really complicated and a really important issue because I was a little bit involved with medRxiv at the launch, and one of the principles is don't discuss this publicly on social media, don't discuss it with the news, this is still not peer reviewed. But that did shift, as we all know, and top news programs on the radio and in television started reporting preprints. And responsible journalists would always add the caveat saying this has not been peer reviewed yet, but we still think it's really important. So as I mentioned earlier, I think the intention of preprints and medRxiv did shift with the pandemic, and it did shift such that we know it is important to make some of this information public, with that caveat that it's not been peer reviewed, but we can't hold fast to this, don't promote it in the media. So I think it was education to the public, but also education for us. And I guess broadly, it's just making sure that whatever venue you're using to communicate this information, it's fit for purpose, and that can change over time. So we didn't have a pandemic going like COVID when medRxiv was launched, so it was more important to not report things in the media, and then you need to balance those risks and those benefits when the pandemic hit. And we decided, and the media decided, it wasn't really our call, that yes, it's okay to publicize this information because it is of importance, but does need to be stated with that caveat. And I think the public, definitely responsible journalists, understood what we were trying to do. And, with the Trump presidency, misinformation was everywhere. And I think we're all learning how to filter what's real and what's not real. Some people are doing a better job than others, but I think that's needs to be an ongoing discussion that we have. And I think it's really important for us as editors, as publishers, as journalists to be at the forefront of that discussion.
Although preprint servers like bioRxiv or medRxiv have space for comments, the authors we've spoken to for the EMBO podcast and the Review Commons blog all say that they seldom, if ever, get post-publication feedback directly on these platforms. Preprints do generate discussion, often a lot of it, including high-quality scientific interactions that would qualify as post-publication peer review. But these are almost exclusively either through personal communication or social media. It should be noted that this conversation with Adrian and Thomas was recorded before the recent changes at Twitter and what many have termed the Mastodon migration.
Social media is very, very powerful. And on the one hand, I think even carrying out the most formal peer review in a journal, you're trying to have a conversation. You're trying to have a conversation between the author and the reviewer. And hopefully it's a civil and constructive conversation. But even in peer review, people take things personally and it goes off topic. But the same happens on social media. And for me, any information, any conversation is useful. But for whatever reason, Twitter, social media, it's driven more by popularity. People don't put as much thought into their tweets as they will if they're doing a peer review. So the context, I do think, matters. And I think there is a gradient where comments on an article aren't as valuable as the formal peer review that a journal might do. Rapid responses on articles are probably somewhere in between because they are moderated. And then you have social media, which is a bit more of the Wild West. And sometimes that's not a bad thing. And because people are passionate and there are emotive aspects to COVID. I mean, it affected all aspects of our lives. Lockdowns, some people agree, some people very much disagreed. And the truth is somewhere in the middle, and there's a lot of room for debate there. So in some ways, the discussion on social media is really valuable, but it does get out of control. And I think that's why editors are really important, because they serve as a judge. They take all of this information in, whether it's from peer reviewers or what's happening on social media, and they decide, is this useful? Is this really contributing to the conversation? Is this person trustworthy, or are they conflicted? And you come up with some sort of solution for the article. You know, how does this really inform the article? Should we make any changes? Should we post a correction or make a retraction? But I think the editor's in the best position to understand context and to weigh the different discussions that are happening. I guess it's challenging, and that's something we're all trying to cope with, is with journals which carry out peer review. The discussion continues after you publish it, and you need to know, for whatever reason, the discussion that happens post peer review is valued less than what happens to actually publish the article. And I think that needs to change somewhat. And I think preprints tie into that, where things are posted immediately and the discussion happens more in real time.
Thomas Lemberger originally trained as a molecular biologist at the University of Lausanne. Thomas joined EMBO to launch the open access journal Molecular Systems Biology. He's the project leader for EMBO's platform for curated peer review of preprints, Review Commons. Review Commons began offering authors the option to post their refereed preprint to medRxiv in July of 2020. It had been posting them to bioRxiv from day one.
In a clinical and medical field, I just am interested to hear your thoughts about the focus of the peer review process. At EMBO, we have sort of basic research journals, and we are very acutely aware of things like the novelty of a discovery, the conceptual advance, and the depth of the characterization, and so on and so on. And I just wonder if, you know, what is the case in the medical field, if the focus of peer review is maybe slightly different, or you know, what do you pay attention to?
I mean, there's so many things that tie into what we want peer review to do. I think above all, and I sometimes phrase it as, we want to make sure that what we publish isn't wrong. It's never going to be 100% right. It's not an exact science. The important thing is that authors are cautious with their interpretation. So we're very much proponents of being upfront about limitations, not overstating your findings. I think often researchers really want to sell their research to us and say that this is groundbreaking and clinical practice needs to change from this observational study. But for us, we know it's an observational study. It's useful, it adds to the evidence base, but it's not going to change everything. And that's what we want to see. We don't want to see you saying that this is going to have a big impact. We want you to say this is going to have a small impact, maybe not even that much of an impact. Maybe the impact is it will lead to a better study or a bigger study or a clinical trial or something like that. So that for me is important. And I think that's what I try to communicate when I talk to authors, is that you're not trying to sell me this research. You're trying to publish something which is useful and accurate. So for me, I'm not a doctor, but I'm a researcher and I'm a reader and I'm a patient. I'm a member of the public, and I want papers not to be written for a specialized, only researchers can understand it. I want it to be well reported. I want it to be understandable to patients, to caregivers, whoever has the motivation to understand this piece of work, that it might be meaningful to that person. I want them to understand it. So I try to emphasize writing with as little jargon as possible, in plain language whenever possible, and trying to communicate that to peer reviewers can be challenging, but that is what we're looking for, and editors can also provide their own comments on this area.
So how do authors react to this sort of strongly encouraged modesty about the claims? Is it less of an issue maybe in the medical field that there are strong egos that want actually to make big discoveries that are going to change the face of the world? Or is it a cultural difference with fundamental research, or basic research, I should say?
Yeah, I think there's a huge number of differences between authors. And yeah, I worked in research, I guess it was 15 years ago now, 20 years ago even. And I remember it being about telling a story, selling your research. If you want to be published in the top journals, you need to really emphasize what's interesting, not do anything, well, I think it is unethical, but not fudge your numbers, but to emphasize what in your data is interesting. Whereas for me now, we don't want to do that. We're very strict about reporting things according to how you plan to report them in your study protocol, or as I say, stating limitations and being upfront. And I think there is a shift, just talking to authors. I think it's the early career researchers who are on board with this, because they struggle to get published in the Lancet or the BMJ. So they see, I want to publish this. And also I think they understand the ethics of it. We're now a bit more aware of the risks of publishing the glamorous research, which isn't right. Lives can be threatened, patient care can be really poor, can have massive impacts on human life by reporting this glamorous science, which you've spun or fabricated some way. So yeah, I think it can be challenging for authors to consolidate those two sides of the story, because ultimately you want to be successful in your life, you want to get the promotion, you want to get a good job, and to do that you need to publish in the big journals. But at the same time, ultimately we care the most about ethical reporting and patient care. Yeah, so going back to the issue of what we want peer review to accomplish, for me it's helping authors make their work better, to help them report their research. And I think a big emphasis for me is publishing work in countries and to authors who don't have the resources that we have in Europe, in the UK, and getting them peer reviewers who can then just help them, point them in the right direction, and provide them with constructive criticism and help them get published in a journal like BMJ Open. I think that's a really fantastic thing. Yeah, so I think there's different places to go for different researchers, but we'd like to hopefully tie that all together and emphasize quality. So the BMJ publishes bigger studies, more impactful studies than BMJ Open, but we do have the same principles in terms of ethical reporting. So yeah, there's that constant between us, I think.
What is in there for the reviewers? You participated to a workshop that we organized at EMBO on this theme of academic credit to reviewers. And if I remember well, you had this wonderful quote that peer review matters really, and depending what a reviewer says or write in the report, it may affect actually the patients at the end of the day. And you also just mentioned that, the role of the peer review process in a medical field is to make sure that something is not wrong, at least, because of course wrong findings can be very toxic. So what is in there for the reviewers? Are they accountable if they say something wrong, if they make a mistake? Are they accountable? Are we going to sue them? You wrote a wrong review. And sort of what kind of reward do they receive to actually make the right call, which might be sometimes very difficult and time consuming?
Yeah, no, that's a big question and a big challenge, because it's a huge amount of responsibility that we're putting on these peer reviewers. Like, as we discussed earlier, it's all just a conversation, whether that's on social media or a peer review, but the peer review for the actual journal is much more important, and it's elevated, and it's a huge responsibility. But as you say, there's not a big reward. I mean, I think as much as possible, you'd like to think that the reward is being an active participant in the publication of this article. And for us, we want to make sure that that's transparent and clear, which is why we use open peer review on BMJ Open. So we publish the review alongside the article, and we publish the names of the reviewers so they get credit. But on the flip side, that opens them up to criticism as much as the authors in some ways, which can be challenging. But I guess ultimately that does just really emphasize the responsibility of the peer reviewer. And a good peer reviewer knows this. They want to take on that responsibility. Hopefully they like the fact that we're being transparent and posting their review alongside. And there are tools available. So ORCID, you can now see where you've reviewed. So getting bigger recognition for reviewers is something that we're working on, but it is a real challenge, because we do see, I mean, I don't know what percent of medical journals use open peer review, but it's very, very small. And you do see, and it's small because it's challenging, and a lot of journals don't want to take that on. But you will see social media saying, how does this count as a review on this paper because it's short, or something like that. And that happens on all journals, and a short review is not necessarily a bad review. I always like to make that point. But yeah, you do open yourself up to criticism. Yeah, so any kind of incentives, or reviewers sometimes say they want to be paid to do these reviews, and the BMJs tried that in the past, but reviewers weren't that open to it, because you'll never pay them as much as they would be paid for their regular job, so it seems small in comparison. So yeah, that's something that we're really struggling with at the moment. It is hard to find reviewers, especially when we have discussed the volume of science and the volume of these research manuscripts has increased. So we need more and more reviewers, and it is challenging to find them. We are coming up with new incentives like the open peer review, like the ORCID, mentioning it, but it is always going to be difficult. Yeah, and I can imagine with Reviewer Commons, I think where the reviewer is doing their review definitely impacts how likely they are to do it. I think the BMJ has an easier time finding reviewers than BMJ Open, but I think being a reader of that journal does make it easier. But yeah, I think it's a challenge for all areas in publishing.
So it's true that it is difficult to find reviewers, and I think it's often not appreciated how much effort it is to actually recruit good reviewers and to select them and convince them to deliver at the end of the day. And how do you see a little bit what we are trying with Review Commons, which is to review the papers for a very good set of journals? So the motivation of the reviewers in principle is there, but to do that before submission to the journal, such that the journals then do not engage into repeated or redundant rounds of review and rejecting the paper and then reviewing from scratch. And sometimes you have 12 or even more reviewers having been involved in the publication of a paper. Do you see maybe your journal once applying this kind of system, or what's your vision about that?
Yeah, so for me, receiving a review alongside a submission which has been reviewed in Review Commons or in another journal or in another preprint server is useful. It's always useful to have information for an editor. You can use that information, you can disregard it depending on all of the context and all of the factors around it. But for me, we just discussed how difficult it is to find reviewers. If somebody can help us out with that, that's a really positive thing for me. The challenges we've had from there's been a number of publishers who have tried something like this to get a review on a manuscript before submitting it to a journal using various different methods. The challenges for us have been when we can't see the reviewer's name. So open peer review is a core principle of BMJ Open. So if we don't see the reviewer's name, we can't really use it. Again, it can be informative for us, but it's not. We want to have that discussion potentially with the reviewer, and we want to know if there are any competing interests. That's really the most important thing to us. It could be a highly conflicted report, and we just don't know it. And the other challenge is BMJ Open emphasizes certain qualities of a manuscript to decide on publication. So as I said, the completeness of the reporting, whether a reviewer has assessed the statistics. Certain papers we have a more formal statistical review if it's going to directly impact patient care. So sometimes it's hard for us to know. And I think looking at Review Commons, you're covering a lot of those things, which is fantastic. I guess the risk for me is authors taking the perspective that they've had 2 positive reviews in Review Commons or wherever. How is this journal not going to publish it? Whereas an editor, I might want to add to that information, get my own review, or I might notice something that the reviewers haven't noticed and I want to reject that. I'm not just going to disregard my own thoughts because it's had positive reviews elsewhere. So yeah, as I say, any information is useful for us, but we also want to have our own say in our own analysis to make sure that it conforms to BMJ Open, which even though we say we don't emphasize novelty in advance when we publish anything which was well reported and sound, we do still have certain elements which are really important to BMJ Open, which might not be important in other areas.
Yeah, so it's interesting you mentioned this sort of configuration of having positive reports from the reviewers, but then having an editor who says, from my point of view, actually it doesn't belong to the scope or to the editorial level. And so it brings us a little bit to something I wanted to discuss with you, which is now the role of the editors, or, from there, the role of the journals. Now that we have medRxiv, that we have bioRxiv, that we even have refereed preprint from Review Commons with a preprint 3 reviews and even the reply from the authors, some are asking, well, what is the role of the journals? And so you just mentioned the editors sometimes plays the arbiter. It has its own or her own vision of the scope of the journal and its selectivity. And there is also the issue of conflict of interest and checking that the reviewers are indeed those independent experts that we would like to have. So what's your vision of the role of the journals, and maybe also as a chief editor of BMJ Open, what is the role of the selectivity of journals? Is that important, or is it condemned to disappear?
I guess BMJ Open is I do think of it as being on a continuum. We're not a journal as thorough as the BMJ, as the Lancet, but at the same time, we do carry out peer review, more so than Reviewer Commons or preprint, which just takes comments. But for me, the role of the editor is to weigh the information, as you said, an arbiter, a judge, to decide, is this something that's important? And to also, I guess, it's a lot of responsibility, because ultimately I'm responsible for what BMJ Open publishes, which for me is a really positive thing. I like that responsibility. I like to say that we publish this paper, which is in the news, and which is having that importance. But it's also potentially quite scary, because if we publish something which is incorrect, it's on me. So for me, I think journals, publishers do add trustworthiness onto things, because you're not just taking almost an AI or machine learning approach where you have these 2 reviews and they're both positive. So you're saying, well, there's nothing negative here, we should put it up. It's not, and it's also not just about publishing or not publishing, it's about making compromises, completing the reporting. Are you being clear with your limitations? If not, state it. Or if you have two reviewers who disagree and reviewers also disagree, not just taking one side or allowing the authors to make a decision, but trying to incorporate every perspective into that final article. I think that's a big responsibility for editors, and I think there's a risk of that being lost if we were to do away with journals like that. And there's also a big role of journals when it comes to disseminating and providing impact to research. It's not just editors involved. We have a press team, we have publishers, and I'm really proud to work at BMJ. I think we've built a really fantastic brand because we are seen as being trustworthy, reliable, ethical, doing things like open peer review. So I think that adds a lot of value to the work.
Several initiatives do exist, including but in no way limited to Review Commons, to organize the peer review process of preprints. These vary a lot in the degree of editorial involvement, if independent editors are involved at all. Thomas also leads an EMBO effort to curate different preprints from diverse peer review platforms, the Early Evidence Base, which you can consult online. EMBO Press, Review Commons, and BMJ Open all have transparent peer review processes. But at BMJ Open, reviewers are also asked to sign their reviews.
For us, and I think medicine is different from molecular biology, where there are conflicts of interest related to drugs, devices, big issues within the medical community. There might be a strong proponent for or against lockdowns, for example. So for us, it is necessary, I think, ultimately, for us to operate the journal using the principles we want. I think we do need to have the names of the reviewers. And as I said earlier, we want them to have their credit when we post the article in the peer reviews. It's good to see that person's name. But yeah, there is that flip side. It opens them up to criticism. Thankfully, I've not heard any real stories of these reviewers having these negative consequences that people fear. I mean, it might happen, I've just not heard it, but it seems to me that people respect the reviewer if they've got an opinion, which might lead to an article's rejection. And I think, like I said, in the evidence for open peer review, people are more positive, people are more constructive, so it leads, passing on your name to the authors does lead you to be more constructive, more positive. Yeah, and I'm sure there are cases where reviewers have had negative consequences, but for us it's kind of the risks and the rewards for it. And I think based on the nature of medicine and how medicine works in society today, we think it's a really positive thing to have that name of the reviewer attached to it for full transparency. But it is a difficult decision, and that could even change over time. I think when we made the decision to use open peer review at BMJ, it was before social media was what it is today, and we could never have foreseen just how powerful and how stressful Twitter can be for a person if they're criticizing somebody. So yeah, I think we don't have any plans on changing the way we do things, but we are taking a data-driven approach. So if we do find that we should change things, we would change them. But yeah, it is important to keep doing research on peer review, and that's something I'm quite passionate about. And we do use BMJ Open to study different interventions in terms of peer reviews, having people check the reporting as an extra step, having an assessment of spin in the abstract, and running all kinds of studies. I think that's really important. I know EMBO does similar work, which is really fantastic. I think it's important to take a data-driven approach, and it's important to keep studying peer review and how these variables impact things ultimately. And as I say, these things do change over time. So what we found 10 years ago might not be true today.
You mentioned that the transparent peer review or the open peer review result often on a tone that is more constructive and maybe helpful. What's your experience, as an editor now with many years of experience, on what would be your recommendations to reviewers about the tone of a review? If you have criticism, should they be really robust and very clear, or should you exert some modesty, diplomacy, or what has this any importance on the side of the authors and maybe also on the side of the editors?
Yeah, I emphasize diplomacy when it comes to these things, because people can get really passionate about it, and nobody likes being criticized, especially when it's their work that they're doing. So it is difficult, because sometimes it is a piece of work could have an impact, and we want to be clear that it should be rejected from a reviewer. They want to emphasize that and not be overly polite, such that an editor maybe not reading enough detail sees it as being positive when it's in fact negative. But ultimately, there is a lot of diplomacy involved, especially with open peer reviews, so they are going to know who you are. But I think the world needs a bit more being polite and trying to be constructive and helpful, rather than being critical and trying to show off how much you know or how much more you might know about a topic than the other person. It's not about that. It's about improving.
Yeah, I totally agree. I totally agree with that. They have a respectful tone that is acceptable on the other side is kind of fundamental. But just to play a little bit the devil's advocate, I found as an editor, it can be easier to overrule negative comments and to say, well, these comments criticize this and that, but actually for our journalists, it's not absolutely necessary, and we can resolve this, in a sort of a compromise way. But as an editor, it is much more difficult to overrule positive comments. So if you have a very positive reviews on a paper where, as an editor, you are quite critical, it becomes very difficult to overrule in this direction. Have you made this experience too?
I think in some ways I guess the extremes are interesting. I think if we have one negative reviewer who points out a fundamental flaw, even if I quite like the paper, if there's no changing that flaw, if the research question is flawed, the methods can't support the data, then no matter how much other positive information there is, and I agree with what the reviewer is saying, we will reject it. Yeah, at the same time, well, if I do have an overly positive review, I'm always a bit skeptical of it. For me, I tend to like the reviews which are written fairly neutrally and in a way that's designed to help the authors. I think that's more meaningful to me than somebody whose tone is either very negative or very positive.
One of the questions we really often ask is if you're having a positive experience with a refereed preprint, which is curated by a professional editor and the reviewers are highly qualified, and it's incorporated all of these reviewer cross-comments features and so forth, is what is the role of a journal? Like why do you need the journal? And the answer they give broadly matches what you said, is that, well, there's just too much information. And I need to aggregate what I read somehow. I need a filter for the unit, something that tells me what kind of audience this is relevant for. Is it for a medical audience? Is it for dictyostelium, evolution of apoptosis field or something? I need to find those, and that's a lot trickier than people who are not in science may think. And it's something that affects the way they look at the peer reviews, because what we get as one of the very surprising things for me when I joined the project was that more than people praising speed, which I think was really an early motivation for the Review Commons project, was just reducing waste in the peer review process, they like the tone of the reviews because they focus on the content of the paper more than the fit for a journal. And I think, and having worked with Thomas for a while now and having worked at a traditional journal for a few years, I think that's really the editor's job, is to decide, given the scientific critique of the paper, is it a good fit for me, for my journal, for my readers? And that really is an editorial task that should not be farmed out to the reviewers. And it affects the way people write their reviews. And the only other thing I would say, just as a PSA, because I always tell people, if you are angry and you thought you spent time, it's a lot of work reviewing a paper, reading a really bad piece of work. Be careful with the tone of your review, because you might be right and it might be an important point, but what will end up is people discussing the tone of your review. If it's personal or not personal, is it civil or not civil? And you may be saying something like, there's no control in this paper, but it may have made you so angry, right, that you wrote something, along the lines of the authors are idiots or something like that, and then it becomes a discussion not about the content. It takes the discussion away from what you think is important to discuss, and it gives people another angle to disregard what could be in the middle of a lot of vitriol, a valid critique of the work.
Yeah, there's no benefit to anyone, I think, if you're taking a really harsh negative tone. The only benefit is that it allows you to vent your anger to somebody, but really it's not going to, like you said, it's not going to help get the paper rejected. It's just going to have the editor take the review less seriously, and obviously it's not going to help your relationship with the authors if you ever run into them in a conference. So I think, like anything, it is a job. You need to be professional about it and be conscious of that.
But I do think the openness improves that a lot, because most people are embarrassed, even if it is anonymous. They don't want to be seen like that in public, and I think it goes for authors as well when they write their appeals. So the advice I usually give people is have a notebook, not your computer, an actual notebook, and write the letter you want to write and talk about the reviewer's mother and what they may or may not have done in unnatural acts. And then you just get it out and then tear it up and flush it down the toilet, and then write on your computer the thing you need to write to have a professional interaction, as you say.
Yeah, absolutely. I always advise authors, don't respond immediately. give it a night. Go to the pub for a night, and then work on a much more polite response in the morning.
To find out more about BMJ Open's transparent peer review process, visit bmjopen.bmj.com. To explore the Review Commons refereed preprint platform, which also features public posting of reviews and author responses, visit our webpage. Thank you for listening to the EMBO Podcast.